Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good middle of the night, wherever you are. This is week 2 of Enterprise Risk and Data Analytics.
Try this again.
I'm going to get all videos posted on Sunday, the start of the second week, so stick with me. I also want to post a very interesting article about how data analytics, open source data that someone posts about how well they like or dislike working on Glassdoor is now being used to assess companies, to give you an idea of how we see data analytics going on in our daily work life and aren't aware of it. But before we get to that, we want to talk a little bit about what I mean by data analytics or risk analytics.
We say, is it low, medium, or high? It doesn't matter to say it's 90%.
And I just have to find the right button to advance the slide. There we go.
We just say, is it low?
So we're talking about risk analytics and data analytics.
Knows my name.
Basically, analytics is how we
low criticality of the data.
Obtain,
medium would be
how
and perhaps
store and process and analyze and look at that data. So that's data analytics, and risk analytics is how we're looking at that data, looking for risk. So that's what you're going to see from this Glassdoor article.
A lot of times we fall back on the qualitative
notion. So here's something I want you to keep in mind.
When we talk about
we use a couple of sets of definitions, and that is because risk science is actually an old science, and it came up with this terminology, and we're kind of changing the terminology. Cybersecurity risk uses its own terminology. So bear with me. Sometimes we'll call it a hazard. Sometimes we'll call it an impact, severity or an impact or hazard. That's because I want you aware of some of the classic nomenclature. But at the same time, I want you to be aware that, as I've said before, this is a new and exciting area brought by the perfect storm of three things. First of all, the advances in hardware technology that we can cheaply store mounds of data.
Or when we talk about
the advances in software technology that we can go out and get data all over the place, scrape it off Facebook and social media, analyze it off databases, take it off the supply chain metrics, look at logs for how systems perform.
That's tough to quantify.
And then the third leg of the stool, which people sometimes forget, is the advances in mathematics that has given us the underlying ability to develop very powerful data analytics.
We're on the tipping point.
Algorithms. So here's a little something I learned a long time ago when I was getting my PhD.
To figure out enterprise risk.
When a field is new, we haven't settled on the terminology.
In business.
So we'll use old terms and new terms, and sometimes the new terms will be used incorrectly because we haven't yet settled on the terminology, because the field is developing and evolving. So part of this is going to be, okay, we're going to use the same terms for different
the ones that will pioneer will be the ones
concepts. But it's like people calling a car an automobile, or but it was once called a horseless vehicle, right? It's kind of this historical terminology that gets applied as new terminology.
But then here's the problem with that.
So we want to talk about a little bit about the history and importance, because this is not new. Risk analytics goes back to the beginning of civilization, because frankly, to survive, you have to be able to consider and analyze risk. I mentioned this
regarding the importance of financial risk.
In one of my first lectures where I said, when I teach cybersecurity risk, I always ask people how many of themselves consider themselves risk experts. No one ever puts up their hand, and then I point out to them that in their daily life, they're constantly accessing, monitoring, analyzing, and managing risk. We all have to do it. We all have to do it, and we do it in all aspects of our life, but because it's so common, we don't realize that. We don't realize how much we know about risk.
It was huge compared to what we have, right?
I know, again, I'm putting a lot of words on the slides. I think I need to break that
even though you
tendency, but basically this is just, it studies the underlying uncertainty of a decision or course of action, and we live in a world of uncertainty.
Mr. Osborne was a smart guy.
So when we talk about risk analytics, it's continuous, but it's also dynamic. The risk can change. Something happens last week, and I read 4 or 5 commentators that say we're heading for a recession.
It's going to be lighter. It's going to be faster.
And then something happens and the market shoots up, and I read a commentator that says, oh, no, we're in for a great ride. And yet somebody else says, no, we're just getting ready for a fall, right? They are trying to analyze the continuous dynamic nature of risk. And so what we're going to talk about this week is just the commonality of risk assessments, whether it's
the best example.
a simple decision matrix, you know, here's what I think is going to happen. Here's the probability. Here's what I need to do if it happens. To what's emerging is our artificial intelligence training system processing. So now we have a system that can analyze way too much data, terabytes and terabytes of data, and apply what has been built by a human. No AI systems, purely artificial intelligence. So while there has to be a human in there developing the algorithm or the like,
we need to look at that again
what it comes up with.
Holistic risk management.
So let's talk about the basics.
Talking about that with our
we talk about hazards, and by hazards we mean risk factors. Hazards being the old term. We talk about probability. All risk is probabilistic in nature. We can't think of every possible risk. What's the probability I'm going to get?
We can't worry about
hit by a car the next time I cross the street.
You know, we
might
don't
be very small, but there's a probability.
What's
the probability I'm going to
paralysis through analysis?
Have lunch with a friend and order a hamburger.
We targeted like 30
that's cascading probabilities. But everything is probabilistic, right? Because we're constantly making new decisions. And the severity is what we often call, what I call impact. So we have our risk factors. What are those things that can cause us problems? And what is the probability of those happening? But we always, if you get nothing out of this class,
financial area,
the basic is you have to look at the impact. When we talk about the risk, when we talk about the probability, we always want to talk about the consequence, the severity, the impact. I don't like the word severity because sometimes I think it leads people to incorrectly assume that something really bad has to happen. Something really bad doesn't have to happen. Something might happen, but further down the line as we go through this complicated network of risk factors.
It's a compliance risk. It's a legal risk.
It might lead to something
because of the nature of the law,
severe consequence. So I like to call it violating law. Okay, so my slide got a little offset here with the hazard risk, but basically what we do is we look at the probability, we look at the severity or the impact, and we come up with an estimation, and then we look at the criteria, and then we say, okay, how are we going to evaluate that risk? And why do, again, we want to evaluate that risk? We want to evaluate it so we can now say, do we accept it? Do we avoid it? Do we mitigate it? Do we transfer it?
And also,
so hazards are potential sources of harm, and they don't have to be only capable of causing harm. So that's what I don't like about the term hazards. Like I said, something can be
this is another reason why
an intermediate impact, and it may or may not down a cascading line of risk have a compact, an impact. Might have a compact too. And risk is a probability that exposure to that hazard will cause harm. And just,
if it's
excuse me, remember what I said.
It doesn't have
risk is the probability of loss.
You have to be careful.
That's my little definition I give my undergraduates in cybersecurity. I give them simple little definitions for vulnerability for exploit when we're talking specifically about cybersecurity, and it's a probability of loss.
Hey, here's the 30 risks we're going to look at.
And so you can't see all the slide here, but basically it says, you know, a chainsaw might be a hazard to one.
Maybe
a logger, but lightning may be a hazard to someone else. We have our hazards, our risk, potential sources of harm differ from what job we're doing.
So again, this
so hazards can cause harm, but not continuously. So what this is trying to say is it's dynamic. So the rate of probability in which a hazard causes harm is important. It will change over time. Nothing in our world is static anymore.
We really don't have the answers.
We want to call that the risk probability, and it's a hazard because of the risk. You know, something could happen. Like I could be sitting here right now and get hit by a meteor.
We tend to think the bigger it is, the harder it'll
probability
fall kind of thing.
It does exist. It's so close to being zero that we consider it zero.
In some ways, the small company,
you know, but out in space, what this example says is the meteor strike goes on all the time, but kind of who cares because it's out in space and space is big and there's nothing there for it to harm.
Goes out of business, or you have a company.
So the risk has a severity and the impact, and this is where it's important. The examples my students come up with are really very basic but very good. Flammable clothes and gas-soaked clothes do not have the same risk severity.
And here's a couple of reasons why.
Flammable clothing may have an impact,
to a big company,
but
the risk
soaking your clothes in gasoline is probably going to have a worse impact. Okay, they use this about broken dishes for a restaurant. That may be common, but its severity is very low. Remember, I made the joke about when I showed up at the nice dinner at a nice restaurant wearing two different colored, mismatched shoes.
In some ways,
the risk you're going to do something may be there, but the impact's so low, it doesn't matter. Whereas if I
one of the risks they'll have
ran
is in their supplier chain.
Safety area and I wore my open-toed heel shoes instead of my
kind of saying the same
required safety boots.
At the end of the day,
severity or impact could be much more.
Kind of pyramid. CEO in a small business.
So the probability of occurrence plus its severity is a risk estimation. And I'm going to tell you right now, and I'm going to say this again and again, we're in an exciting time because nobody knows how to really do this. You are on the forefront of new work in risk analytics because of the rapid changes in technology, those three that I mentioned, the hardware, the software, and the mathematics.
The pyramid was getting
so
wider.
We are learning more and more about risk. If anyone tells you, "Oh, I'm a risk manager,"
problem
we got that down. We've got a process. We go do this and this. I go home at night, never miss a night's sleep.
So it's kind of like
I have a video somewhere of
I'm an HR person
with one of my senior of students who's a risk manager.
Myself,
and
I'm a technology person.
How many Deloitte, and I will see if I can dig that up and post it. Because of some of the problems that occur.
I see it as a cyber
just
risk.
things change. Things can change overnight.
We have to be careful of this.
So
we have to be able to.
It's a probability of occurrence.
We have to be able to
look
at the different.
And the severity of its risk, but these are hard factors to come up with. What is going to be that
the HR,
probability, and what's going to be the severity?
IT, important component. The manufacturing,
So our risk managers and strategic managers decide when risk is too much and what is acceptable in areas of their company. That's the public line. In reality, every single worker
when we talk about different
is
risk
handling
types,
risk in some way, whether they are aware of it or not. It is the duty of the risk manager to put together a strategy to be able to identify those risks, to be able to capture their criteria, to be able to analyze it so they can evaluate.
This really disappoints me as a former software engineer.
And then we have the risk estimation. And again, we are doing the best we can. We can do it quantitatively, meaning we can put numbers on it. Or we can do it qualitatively. And I used this example before, but I'll go back to it. I work in cybersecurity. When we talk about data, we talk about the criticality of data, low, medium, high. We do not try to assess numbers. If the data is critically high, it gets the most stringent, strict protection. Doesn't matter if it's 85% critical,
but
99% critical.
There's this real-world complexity.
We just use low, medium, high because of the difficulty of looking at data and saying,
to say
well,
that
is this 20% critical? Is this 35% critical? By the
or
way, where's the line between low and medium?
Legislative.
So what would cause risk estimation to gauge a risk higher than its risk criteria? And this happens a lot of times when people are using their experience or something recently that has happened, and they overestimate risk.
They knowingly lie.
I've heard this before, that we, because of social media emphasizing certain things, that we tend to think we live in a much more dangerous world and all these things happen, when in reality our statistics show it's less dangerous.
Fraud.
I don't think those use experiences. We use anecdotal information. Well,
we have to
the house down the street got broken into, and this happened. So therefore, crime must be going up. The risk of it to my house has gone up. The risk may have gone up because of other factors: the neighborhood, leaving the doors unlocked, not having a security system, not having a dog.
Have his performance,
leaving your valuables in clear view,
what was considered
so they
acceptable
might
by
be
the company.
enticing.
I don't know.
Creating an
But
opportunity. But the risk
lesson for all of
estimation,
us
many
is
times
we
we
can't just
talk
look at
about and
anything
we
in
overly
isolation.
estimate risk
A bad
because we're
group of
not looking at it
engineers and
in
software
a
programmers
clear,
made some
analytical
very bad
manner.
illegal decisions, and it affected the enterprise.
So hazards have a chance to cause harm. So
and
that's
it's
the
inefficient
impact.
because
And this has a probability and a severity, but we want to keep in mind that we are looking at this as something that is evolving, and that is the purpose of this class. I'm not going to say, here is a step-by-step process, and if you do this, you will be able to analyze risk. I want to create a framework that as you go forward in your career, or in your job, in your promotions and whatever, you have a framework to adapt to the changes that we see in hardware, in software, and in mathematics. Thank you for staying with us. I will process this video and get it
and not
on,
communicate
line and have a happy Sunday.
Now, obviously, people aren't going to say, "Hey, I'm lying in my software code," right? But at the same time, as I said before, this isn't a couple of people. You've got a software designer, you've got the coders, you've got the testers, you've got the validators. You have a ton of people who Knew or should have known. And by the way, those are becoming very important legal terms now. It used to be, did you know? Now it's, did you know or should have known? Was it within your job purview to know this was going on? So it's just a bad thing. It's bad all the way around. You can't defend this whole silo approach where I'm going to run my section in isolation. You're part of the enterprise. That section is part of the enterprise and contributes to that risk. But here's the problem that we have again. We try to not aggravate, that's a Freudian slip, aggregate a metric. We want to have an overall metric. We want somebody to just tell us, because otherwise we're looking at this vast, complex network of enterprise risk factors. And we want to say, just tell me, what's is it a 5? Is it a 10? Is it a 15? What does that mean? What does that mean for your risk factors? So we try to target and we try to understand how that fits. But because we're going to look at it as the strategic, the financial, the operational, and all the underlying risk, it's really hard to come up with a set of metrics that accurately produce what we need to know to make good business decisions. So we can calculate metrics. We can give you all the numbers we want. We can carry them out to as many decimal points as you want. But you know what? If it's bad data, garbage in, garbage out, it's not going to tell you what you need. And so part of this class is to investigate, because people will bring technologies to you and say, hey, we have all this data. Let's take all this data. If we analyze it and process it, store it, visualize it, we're going to get the answers. And you have to be able to say, wait a minute, is this technology applicable here? Where's this data coming from? Is the data valid? How did you set this analysis up? If you're not aware of it, right now there's a big issue in algorithm development. There's a book called Algorithms of Oppression. It started out that machine learning, and we'll talk about this when we talk about machine learning, uses data to train. So it started out, it used bad test data. So quite frankly, if you were going to build a market segment or predict people being in a hospital or something like that, and you don't accurately define your data sets, then the system's going to train on invalid data. So for instance, in HR, they trained systems and they found they were inherently biased against women and those from underrepresented groups, because they had trained that on data, but primarily white males, because that was the data that was available. Okay, computers can't do magic. You have to tell them what to do. You have to set something up. They can't invent this. Yesterday or today, I just read on the news where now there is a algorithm that has been found to be used in medical care that prioritizes patient triaging in the wrong order. Again, it's a technical issue, okay? My point is, we want metrics. We want to make it easy. We want to have numbers as managers to look at. From a technical viewpoint, you need to know which questions to ask about where that data comes from. And then it's more about than just risk reporting, okay? I'm going to give you my risk. I'm going to tell you, bye, see you in 6 months. It's a continuous monitoring. Something may change tonight. I may go home tonight, get up tomorrow, pick up my Wall Street Journal or New York Times or one of my many blogs I read and say, oh my gosh, everything I thought got changed because fill in an event, okay? So first of all, it has to be continuing risk assessment, managing. And then once you've analyzed and found the risk, guess what? When you mitigate or use one of your 4 strategies, the dynamics change, and you're constantly having to go back to see how the risk changed. So mitigation is very interesting. It's running the business, it's being compliant, it's looking for opportunities, and it's doing this in a dynamic environment. No, we don't have the luxury of even saying, hey, come for the next 24 hours, nothing changes so I can kind of get a handle on what I'm going. No, we put in trades or tariffs as a government policy, and it affects our business. There's a court decision that comes down. Court decisions come down every day. I try to keep monitoring on them. Some of them are binding. Some are what we call persuasive. They might not be in our appellate district in the U.S., but they may be something that our appellate district says, they got it right, and we're going to incorporate that. And then when we disclose it, how do we disclose it so it makes sense? How do we disclose it so stakeholders can make intelligent decisions? The SEC material rule for publicly traded companies says that we have to disclose a risk that could be of material to making a decision whether to invest in the company. Well, okay, so there's very clever art sometimes to presenting data that no one seems to really understand the content or the meaning of, right? But as it says here, improperly disclosing risk can have huge implications. The SEC can come after you, the FTC can come after you, government regulators can come after you, the media can come after you. And this all leads to risk. It's an important component of how we value companies. How can they manage risk? Look at Apple. How many times has Apple been on the ropes that it could have gone bankrupt? Dell Computer came within one summer of going bankrupt. I think in the early 80s or something, one man gave up a trip to Europe to put the company back on keel because they said it's not going to last. Every company at some point risks completely going bankrupt or under. They are having to reinvent themselves. This isn't just a PR or marketing. This is going back and looking at the risk. IBM still survives after, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They constantly reinvent themselves, but they're not just, it's not a PR. It's not like, okay, today we're going to call ourselves this. It's part of their strategy. It's part of understanding their risk. It's part of, they got rid of their laptop business when it became a commodity. They sold it to a Chinese company. So all this goes to the underlying thing that we are a capitalist country. Companies need to have value because they need to make money for their shareholders. They need to treat their stakeholders correctly, and they need to be profitable. So shareholders is the primary stakeholder, but by no means are they the only stakeholder. Okay, we have regulators, we have the general public. A controversy I got into a few years ago at another university, we were talking about who the customers were of that university, and people said the students. And I said, no, the students are stakeholders. They benefit from what we're doing, but the ultimate customer is the state of Texas, who funds a large part of that public university, but also the public at large and the industry that we're creating future workforce for. But we are not going to tailor what we do to the students as the customers. They are stakeholders, but they are not who ultimately will consume what we're producing. It's the kind of way I looked at it. That's going to end that. Thank you for staying with me. Be back with you soon.